He didn't even mention politics. He knew that was more of a sideshow, a formality for the public. But he did admit to the dominant minority running the whole show, these unseen people behind the scenes. Benjamin Disraeli, who was the Prime Minister of Britain in the 1800s, made the famous statement that those who run government and the country are very, very different from the players that the public see. So the men behind the scenes are unknown generally to the public. And that the high dominant minority group, we call them the lazy boy. The person who works is not one of the dominant minority. The lazy boy does no work. Everything is done for them, you see. That's the key of what's called being truly successful. Everything's managed for you. A comment from one of these people could start wars, because the little aides that run around to hear the little comments will then take on the burden and responsibility legally by implementing, getting rid of someone someone's being troublesome. If that ever went to court, that so-and-so was rubbed out because Lord or whatever, Baron so-and-so didn't like this guy, and the Baron is quite free because the aide that mistakenly misunderstood him would take the blame. That's how things run in the real world. Comments make or break nations. Not too long ago on the CBC, there was a documentary about a man living in Canada who dealt heavily with international movements of armaments for wars. Quite legal. It showed you a little brief flash with his Knight of Malta Masonic gear on. Yes, they're all Masons. It doesn't matter if they're orange, blue, whatever lodge they belong to, they're all Masons. And it went from him to a dealing that he'd had with a company in London who was into a big shareholder really in the world's supply of gold and silver. And what you find when they went on in this documentary, they interviewed the head, again a worker, remember, a person who works is not the dominant minority, but he's certainly up there, he's above the upper middle class level. And he said, yes, well, we're right now, we've got this little war going in Sierra Leone, and they went through Kinimini, which is a British mercenary service that draws ex-Marines and Special Air Service guys in through, I think, the Isle of Wight. That's where they're based. And they put them all over the world, where big private companies, oil companies, diamond companies, want little wars started to clear the people off the land and to get chaos going. And so they showed you some clips in Sierra Leone, and sure enough, they said, there's these ex-British military guys with the black guys they'd hired, having this little war going on there to take over territory, to put into place someone who would be more friendly to this big diamond and gold company. And that's the real world that we live in. There's nothing legally ever done about it, because the boys at the top are the legal system, the real legal system. They're untouchable. And we also have this high Masonic tie-in, because they're sworn to secrecy. That's the beauty of Freemasonry, is every degree that a person goes through, from the bottom to the top, they must retake the oaths of secrecy. And so they get their handshakes, their passwords, their signs, and all this kind of stuff with every degree. But they also must give a penile or a punishment sign that they're also given with every degree. It doesn't stop with the cutting of the throat and all that kind of stuff. It goes on and on and on. So it's a great training ground to recruit workers who will work for a corrupt system and keep silent about it to death. And it's also reinforced into them that if they were to break the silence, what would happen to them? And grown men, at least physically grown men, don't take these oaths lightly. In the bottom lodges is a big joke. They can't imagine anybody ripping them open and tearing things out of them and tossing intestines over their shoulders and all that kind of stuff. You can't imagine it. But those at the very bottom will never be asked to go to that extreme anyway. You can't have half-ripped open carcasses all over the planet. That wouldn't look too good for recruitment. And anyway, they know nothing anyway. But they do keep the system going. They're sworn to uphold the system. For those that think that there's an opposition through say, Marxism or Trotskyism, do your homework and look into the histories there. And you'll find, if you read books written by people like Trotsky, he was a high Freemason himself. He was introduced to it in prison at one time. And he got so carried away with it and the role of it in history making that he was writing a compendium of Masonic history when he had to flee from the Soviet system and vamoose into Latin America, where he was supposedly later assassinated. But if you read the book called My Life by Trotsky, he goes right through. He was escorted through different countries from the Soviet Union as he's been exiled by the NKVD, the precursors of the KGB. He was escorted through different frontiers by these guys, and he said they all walked through with him, showing no papers, but just giving the Masonic signs and passwords. That's in his own book. So for those people who think it's all a big joke, they should do their homework to find out what's really behind it. It might start as something that seems trivial, almost natural, because many people have generations of lower down Freemasons in their family. And they'll say, my dad was a good guy. Albert Pike said that they're the outer portico lower members. It gives a good public image to think they're involved in charity, which maybe they're not really. But they're sworn to uphold the system. Which is rather odd when you really think about it, because if you ask any average lower Freemason from any type of lodge about the system in its present state, when we know there's so much corruption, at least that's what they give us in the media. And that's what they're going to give us. We don't know the whole extent of it. Even the lowest Mason will tell you, well, we don't have this system, we'd have anarchy. So they're all taught this at the very bottom level. And I often wonder if anarchy is opposition to something that's rotten and corrupt. What's archy? The Ark? The Ark? Which covenant that we're talking about here? To whom? To what? And yet, these guys that swear to uphold the system are the same guys who boast in their own books. They're the same guys that were behind every revolution, at least as far back as the 1500s in different parts of Europe. So once they put in this system, they then made it really illegal to alter it anyway at all. I've had so many people email me and phone me who are caught in different stages of waking up. Some are caught in, well, if we get back to gold, we're fine. Well, that's out the window, because, you know, who would own that? Others think, what can we do to fix it? How can you fix it? And my answer to that is, how can you fix or even want to keep something that's totally corrupt to begin with? How can you say, what part of the corrupt things you want to excise And if you excised all the corrupt parts, there's nothing left. Our system is corrupt. We're trained to compete and compete and compete. That's what all the sports is about, apart from the brainwashing and the time wasting. The circus is for the public, as Huxley said. But from school you're taught to do what? To compete, to get little gold stars for being a good parrot. Don't think for yourself, because original thought, especially pre-high school and even during high school, isn't really relished by those in control. They want good parrots. And you learn very quickly that if you get a gold star and the person next to you doesn't, then you're superior to that person there. That's how the system works. So we're graded. Now, Albert Pike made a famous statement too. He said, those Masons who haven't gone through the formal degrees, and people can't figure that out, what he means. What he means is, you see, this is a Masonic system. Everything in your system is Masonic, including your grading system at school. They gave us this grading system. The Masons proudly say they were the ones who pushed for the implementation of universal education everywhere. That's what they mean by we haven't gone through the formal rites. However, once you get onto that platform, get the square hat on and all that kind of stuff in your robe, you're starting to take the pre-rites, you see. So we're already trained in a system of grading. And they have their winners and they have their losers. And the losers generally are put into laboring fields. And that's fine as long as you have an industrial society where you need that type of labor, skilled labor, and tradesmen and all the rest of it. But in a post-industrial society, you don't need all of those hands anymore. You have the machines that do all the carrying. We see that in the big supermarkets now. Things that they can bring 10 pallets at a time down the aisle. They don't need the labor. And these were jobs at one time were taken by the unskilled, the ones who failed the exams or had no interest, perhaps more wisely than others who did try to pass it, because maybe subconsciously they knew most of it was nonsense. Especially when you get gold stars for just learning dates and times and who killed who and that kind of stuff. Stuff written by propagandists. As Lenin said, the victor writes the rules and writes the history. In reality, it's all been the same bunch, regardless of what side you thought they were on. So, the mass man, they understand. Mass psychology is well understood what motivates the masses, because there's a tremendous peer pressure amongst people to conform to the people next door to you. In ancient times, the priesthoods knew that they'd have to dissolve tribes, and once a tribe was out the way, you could then rule over people directly, down to the individual. However, they needed a breeding program for slaves and workers, and so they gave us marriage. The Catholic Church instituted marriage for life, and your wife was often picked for you when you were 14, 15. And when the priest made a suggestion you should marry Maggie over yonder, that was an order. So they kept the births, the marriages, the deaths of everybody, and they knew what's a good stock for one kind of work and a bad stock for another. They understood. It's a breeding program. That's why you keep all these records going back for generations of who's marrying who and who gives offspring to whom. And then the Catholic Church could rule directly through the individual. The tribal cohesion was gone. There was nobody to stand up for you. On the contrary, you'd have to go to the local priest sometimes to stand up for you to the guy above the priest.